Welcome back after the coffee break. Fantastic. Thanks again to the Shadi dance group there for introducing the kind of final presentation topic, which is on solutions. I mentioned before that we'd got Shadi here, who's founder and CEO of Pedestrian. And he's going to talk about the intersection of healthcare solutions, logistics, and in terms of solutions, looking at the kind of logistics momentum, and also the momentum for driverless automated vehicles, looking at what's happening in the States, and also looking at potentially what that means for the future of global logistics, but also particularly here in Europe. So final session of the day. Very delighted to welcome from all the way from the States, from Ann Arbor. If you could join me in welcoming Shadi. Shadi, thank you.
Good afternoon. You guys are still here. Great. Everything is about distance. Unfortunately, that's what Barry said when he lost his wife as he was taking her to a hospital that's 60 miles away from their community. And the reason for that is that in their community, the last hospital closed. And that's happening across a lot of communities like Barry's, because hospitals are losing money in these communities. And if you take a look at what's happening there and why that is happening, you see a population where they don't have adequate health care. They don't even have preventive medicine. In the old days, they used to have a family doctor in these communities. That doesn't happen anymore. More so, they don't even have access to healthy food and healthy lifestyles. And that put a lot of pressure on these hospitals, especially in the emergency room. And they're starting to disappear all across the United States. Now, if we look at Barry's community and communities like it, and we think about solutions only in terms of healthcare or insurance, we would be missing the symptoms for the real cause. And the real cause is access. If we talk about preventive medicine, if we talk about access to healthy lifestyle, if you're looking at food, even though some of these communities are actually farm communities. But what's happening is that with the expansion of road and all these infrastructure, it's actually putting them further away from these resources. Logistics is the lens we should be looking at solving these problems. Betty. She's a very smart woman, and she's a little bit different from Barry. She lives actually in the suburbs of a nice city. And she's really independent in her home. All her children have moved out of the state. And she's done pretty well on her own. And she has very good insurance. So when she decided to do she has a hip surgery, her insurance pretty much covers the whole thing. And the way it works, I'll throw in some hypothetical numbers that are actually not that far from reality. Insurance pays about $20,000. $10,000 go for the surgeon fee and the room and the cost, and $10,000 is actually the hospital profit. However, if Betty has complications or readmission to the hospital, or her stay prolongs, the hospital loses money. And that's exactly what happened in Betty's case. And the issue that caused her to stay a very long period is really not a medical one specifically, but it highlights a bigger issue for Betty and the demographic that Betty's in, which is the 65 and above. You see, Betty doesn't want to go home because if she goes home, there's nobody to get her groceries, nobody to get her pain medication. And she's afraid that's kind of a slippery downslope to getting into an elderly care. And like I said, she's a smart woman. She has done her homework. And she understood statistically that people who are independent in their home, and they stay independent and don't move to an elderly place, every year they actually stay independent they live healthier and longer life, psychologically as well as physically, even if they later move on to an elderly care. But that also highlights a little bit of a bigger issue. You see, for her demographic, every year we can keep an elderly in their home and independent. It has huge implications in the billions of dollars for the state as well as the country overall. And if you think that's a problem now, in 10 years, her demographic is going to triple. So you can think of this as a looming problem, or you start thinking about solutions and opportunities to help Betty and people like her. I love these guys here. This is an article in the New York Times, a good read. It's about the island where people forgot to die. It's a small Greek island, a little bit remote. There's about 10,000 people that live there. They have one doctor. They don't have health insurance. They don't have a hospital. Yet, these guys live longer and healthier than anybody on Earth. Imagine that. There's a lot of scientists, a lot of journalists that went down to that island to try to discover what is the secret. Is it the wine they drink every day? Is it the Mediterranean diet? Is it the socializing? Is it the preventive medicine that administered by their doctor who's part of the community? It's none of the above and all of the above at the same time. We all want to live this lifestyle. We all want to live healthier and longer. But more importantly, we want Barry and Betty to live this lifestyle. And if you look at this, again, from the perspective of only healthcare and insurance, you would be missing the point. But if you start looking at it from a logistic perspective and access, then we start really solving these problems. Let me switch gears a little bit. Who do you think today is the capital of trade and logistics in the world? In terms of capital, in terms of trade, in terms of innovation. Now, before you answer, I want to take you through kind of maybe a little bit of a tour in history, just with a couple of brief spots or stops. One of the oldest trade routes in the world was the Silk Road. Damascus was the capital at that time. We're talking about 100, 200 AC. It was the jewel of the Roman Empire. It had the geographic place. It had the capital. From the Roman emperor all the way down, they loved silk from China. They loved spices from India. So it had a lot of capital. It also had great marketing. Now, marketing at that time was pretty simple. You wanted something, you just go to the market. But what differentiated Damascus is that it had expert traders. They understood what you needed, understood where to buy it, and how to sell it to you. And that made Damascus a very important trade capital. Now, if you fast forward to the 1400s, the undisputed capital of trade in the world was Venice. It was actually pretty remarkable how rich they became from the 1400 to the 1800. They certainly had the geographic place, but that was not the important factor. They also had capital, but not that much. But they had a very important innovation, and very simple one. The noble families that governed the city had this innovation called Colgietta. And my Italian is not that great, but it's close enough. And it's basically a simple format to form a company. But it did something pretty remarkable at that time. It not only allowed the rich families and the noble families to invest, but it allowed capital from outside to invest and be part of that contract. It also allowed merchants and people who commandeered ships to be also part of that. So in essence, what they were doing, they were drawing capital inside Venice, and they're distributing the wealth as well as the risk. And that made it a very rich port. And we know that was one of the main reasons they became rich, is that once the noble families started getting greedy, and they stopped doing that, and they said nobody can sign that contract unless you're one of the noble families, Venice went down in a decade or two. So, do I have any guesses what's the logistic capital of the world today? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Please. Shanghai? Shanghai? No. It's Silicon Valley, and not necessarily the actual geographic location. It's that place in the cloud where you have a digital Silk Road and where the hubs are Google and Amazon, where the barrier for innovation is pretty low. Anybody can participate. So it's not a pie to be divided, but it's actually an ocean to be explored. And nobody illustrated that more than Amazon. Amazon really understood that paradigm and took advantage of it, to the point where it's actually having an effect on the GDP of the US, the gross domestic product. Every day we hear of a new industries being disrupted. I don't know if you guys know Target, but Target is a big chain store. It was unheard of for 10 years ago for them to invest in a small company, $550 million. If we look at CVS, in the US you have CVS and Walgreens. Both are chains for pharmacies. When Amazon announced that they'll be getting into that business and delivering prescription drugs to people at their homes, CVS the second day announced that they will be doing same-day delivery using Uber drivers in Manhattan. The most interesting and latest news is that Amazon will be opening 3,000 Go-Marts. And if you haven't read that, Go-Marts basically are cashierless stores. And that has big implications. If you think just of the grocery business, there is actually more to it than the grocery business itself. There are all the ecosystem. If you think of Cisco, all the IT companies that actually support that system, all of them going to be disrupted because Amazon is going to be doing their own system. There's really have not been better logistics momentum than this year and last year. It's actually one of the best years for logistics. But you have to focus a little bit more, understand what's going on last year from that report. E-commerce had a great year. The issue is they're starting to squeeze the traditional logistics players and driving their cost up. %50 increase in home deliveries in urban areas in just the last 3 years. I mean, that's enormous demand. But if you look at the supply of drivers that are doing those deliveries, there's actually a decrease. If you look at the report by the Department of Labor and Statistics in the United States, there's a 6% drop in growth. And that's driving the cost as well. Even for Amazon, they pay about almost to 20% cost of sales on those deliveries. And in some markets, they actually lose money. So you have a big problem. Where are you going to get those drivers? You cannot outsource them. This is where we come in, and companies like us. Because the solution is driverless future, and that future is now. The question is it really the time for it? Let's talk about timing. Nothing is more powerful than an idea, its time has come. If you think about Uber, do you think Uber would have happened in the 80s or the 90s? You see in the picture there, if you guys remember in the 80s, those brick phones. I don't think so. I highlighted a couple of things over here that really made Uber happen. And we share some of that in the driverless future that we're talking about. Uber really needed you as a consumer to have digital mobility, and that's basically your smartphone. You needed to have secure payments where you don't even worry about how the payment happened or when it happens. You need to have navigation, and not only finding where you are, but finding more people around you and finding millions of people as they service on the same day. Pooling and optimization algorithms. Those algorithms have to be pretty sophisticated. So it's not only the old traveling salesman algorithm, but more sophisticated deep learning algorithms. They had to have cloud communications. Now, what do we mean by that? Cloud communication is something we use as well in our business. We use a company called Twilio. It's the same company that Uber uses. Now, why is that important, and what does Twilio do? They do two things that are really interesting. If you call your Uber driver, a virtual number appears on their end, not your actual number. So that's number one, security. The second thing is that is more interesting, is that it allows small companies, when Uber was starting, as well as us, to appear as we have big customer service centers, when in reality we don't. So what happens when I place a call to Uber and I want to complain, if it's by email, by text, or even by phone? That message goes to the cloud and get analyzed. Even if my tone appears that I'm angry, the AI actually can detect that and can elevate the call. So you can do things you weren't able to do in the past. We think the solution timing for driverless delivery is now. If you look at the right side, this is a great McKinsey report. They talk about all the forms of driverless delivery that we're going to encounter. If you're talking about drones or vehicle like ours, that goes to the last mile. And what's going to differentiate this new momentum that's happening now, a couple of things. You're going to have lower capital investment and higher margins. And I'll explain that in a little bit. The marginal cost per mile or per kilometer that we're delivering at is going to keep getting lower and lower. Right now, we pay $10 to $20 an hour for a driver. In about a year, a driverless delivery will cost about $3. The year after that, it could be $2 and so on. You're going to have a faster adoption and reduced risk and cost. And when I mean adoption, not only by regulation, governments, and insurance, but even people. They're going to be really used to getting driverless delivery, as much as they're used to right now to getting their Amazon package. So let's unpack that a little bit. What does driverless really entails? I kind of try to simplify it over here and look at it from three perspectives. It has to have mobility, logistics, and user experience. Mobility meaning moving a product from point A to point B, so that involves the vehicle as well as the autonomous system that's on it. Logistics is everything you do to optimize that delivery, from pooling to prediction of how your day is going to be, how your month is going to be, how your year is going to happen. And of course, user experience. And that's often an overlooked aspect of a lot of businesses, but it's one of the most crucial part of autonomous delivery. On the other side, you're going to be met with better regulations. So right now, for us, we work with the state of Michigan. And each state in the United States have their own regulation for testing, delivery, and even sanctioning certain bike lanes and certain areas for us to operate on. You're going to have normalization. What I mean by that is people are going to be used to this. And this is a very important component, where people have to be comfortable with that technology. And all of that going to funnel into commoditization. And I'm not talking about just from the business perspective, but even building the software and hardware. I'll give you a quick example of that. About 3 years ago, I used to buy one of the most important aspects or parts of the autonomous vehicle, which is a LiDAR. Basically, it's a laser scanner that can see 10 meters to 20 meters ahead. We used to buy it for about $100,000 3 years ago. This year, it's about $6,000. Next year is going to be about $600. So you're going to see that commoditization come really to fruition in the next 2 years. So let's dig a little bit deeper into that technology and why the timing is right for it. First of all, autonomous. These systems are getting very sophisticated. If you think about software, we're collecting a lot of databases, and those databases are even high digital images of the roads, of the signs, and understanding what they mean. There's massive databases that are being accumulated. Google has been doing a great job of really accumulating that database and even sharing some of it. If you think about the hardware, for instance, we use NVIDIA. Just last month, we got their new platform, which is called Xavier. It's 20 times better processing than the one before it. But here's the interesting part. The algorithm that we're actually creating are similar, they basically work on your CPU, similar to your laptop. But right now, we're changing those algorithms to take advantage of the GPU. Those are the graphic processing units. And what that means is that we're able to process about 200 folds what we used to process just about a year ago, just by changing that algorithms and taking advantage of that hardware. So that autonomous future is here, and it's now. If you think about the 5G infrastructure, you guys doing this in Europe, in the US, they're doing it in a couple of states, and they're going to start having really good coverage by next year. But what does that mean for driverless delivery? Think about some of the issues that we might encounter, what we call edge cases, which are very difficult for an autonomous vehicle. So let's say you're crossing the street, and you encounter one of our vehicles. We have our first vehicle called B1. So B1 is on the crossroad looking at you, and you cannot make up your mind, should I go or should I stop? So that's an edge case, because the autonomous system is confused. What do you want to do? If we have a good 5G infrastructure, we can intervene right away and talk to you through the speakers and say, please go ahead. So that's a very important aspect, and that's happening right now. And I talked about the prediction and algorithms. So it's not enough to do optimization of your logistics. You actually have to predict. And these algorithms are getting really, really good. We can predict things, it's probably a little bit scary, actually. We as humans are not, we think we're unpredictable, but we're very predictable. And cloud communication I talked about before. From a user experience aspect, chatbots and natural language understanding is making a lot of headways, and we'll talk about that next. I think user experience get overlooked and get talked about a lot, but the implementation of it is usually not that great. And I've seen it in a lot of businesses, not just automotive, where it could make a difference plus or minus 20% of your sales, if done right or done poorly. And in this future with driverless delivery, and it probably applies to a lot of other industries as well, the user experience and the modality of interaction, if you're talking about our vehicle, or even a system that you use for your warehouses to understand the data that's around you, is actually changing to chatbots. Even Generation Z is more comfortable with chatbots than they are comfortable with just an app. So apps is going to be a little bit of a history going forward, and chatbots is going to be taken over for everything, pretty much. On the right side is a depiction of our vehicle, B1, which we're going to be showing and announcing in January. On the left side, you see somebody scanning their phone to go into an Amazon Go store, which doesn't have any cashiers. There's about 3 things that are going to be changing dramatically in that future. And again, I keep saying future, but it's happening right now. The business model is going to change. The marketing will change. And you're going to see different disruptive players that you haven't even thought about as logistic players in this field. Let's talk about the business model a little bit. You guys have Tesco in here. So Tesco, if they want to do a medium-sized store to a large one, that's what they call a large format store. In the US, it costs about $20 million. And the return on investment and the margins are pretty low, and they're very competitive. But if you start thinking like Amazon and thinking about these stores that are Go Marts, that's what they call them, your capital expense is really down and your margins are way up. Not only that, you're meeting the customer where they are and providing them what they need. And that's quite a game changer. This shows our B1 and B2. This is one of the stores we're working with where we actually turned the trailer into a fridge. It's basically a vending machine for fresh food and vegetables. Your marketing will change as well. We're used to, right now, to do ethnographic studies. We used to do paternalistic design to understand or kind of nudge the user into doing something or purchasing something. Anybody who dealt with any store, Target or Tesco, knows that the eye-level shelf is a prime spot, and you have to pay extra to put your product there, because as humans, it's very easy to kind of push us or nudge us to buy something at our eye level. But in this driverless future, things are going to be different from a marketing perspective. That experience is going to have to do a couple of things that are a little bit different. It's going to offer contextual and complementary and adjacent services. What do I mean by that? So let's say B1 is delivering a prescription drug to your doorstep. It knows, the pharmacy knows you have a cold. So in our cold compartment, we're going to put some juice because more than likely you want to pick that up as well. Not only that, your neighbor, who's also a customer of that pharmacy, might have their prescription renewed. So we'll remind him and drop by his prescription medicine. In that essence, you actually lower the marginal cost of your delivery. You're doing pooling at the same time. But the important part about this experience is that it's offering contextual complementary services. Similar when you walk out of the store and you see all those stacks of items they want to sell you for last-minute purchase. You're going to need to optimize what you're offering, what you're delivering, to the lowest comparative cost. So right now, if you purchase something on Amazon, it'll show you what is cheaper, what is better. You're going to have to offer the same kind of experience. And last, what driverless allows you to do is instant gratification. And that's a very important aspect. Because a lot of people, they want something and they want it now. And you could actually charge bigger margins for that. And what's interesting about it is that you can, the analytics side of it, you can actually predict that behavior. I was really shocked about 4 years ago when we did a big study for an automotive company. We were trying to understand how do people purchase vehicles, what options, would they like a smart assistant in the car that talked to them through voice. And remarkably, by understanding what they eat for breakfast, what kind of shows they watch, what kind of drinks they like to have, we had a very good statistical lock on what kind of options you would like. So analytics becomes a totally different mode of understanding your consumer and marketing to them. The players, they're going to be totally different. I like this quote by Apple. The car is the ultimate mobile device. Why do you think Dyson and Apple are getting into the autonomous car business? I mean, it seems kind of bizarre, especially for Dyson. What do they know? We don't know. Why is he spending about $15 to $20 billion? Why is he buying a battery company, investing in it out of Michigan, where I'm from? One of the clues is in here, that Harvard Business Review, which is a very good article. It talks about that the future of electric vehicles is a golf cart, not a Tesla. Here is the interesting insight, and I come from the automotive industry. Mercedes or Ford will have a hard time understanding the consumer or the customer that Apple or Google understands. That's a hard know-how to acquire. But if you look at Apple or Dyson, it's an easier task for them to acquire how to make a vehicle. Because there's a lot of tier 1 suppliers, a lot of tier 2 suppliers that can make that happen. So you're going to see really some interesting people pop up in the driverless delivery as well as in the autonomous delivery. We happen to think that the driverless delivery vehicle is the ultimate appliance. Our vehicles are made specifically for the purpose it's intended to. It's not something where you take a car that's meant for people with a suspension and all the costs that comes with it that are made for people, and then you're making it for delivery. These vehicles are made to deliver food, to deliver prescription, and they were built that way. And that's why we think the vehicle, the driverless delivery vehicle, is the mobile appliance. Last, I want to leave you with this. Driverless will have a big impact. We're very enthusiastic and excited about it because it solves problems for society, like the one we were talking about for Barry and Betty. It's going to help a lot of people who are homebound that cannot move out of their houses or cannot be independent. Second, we're going to unlock a lot of opportunities. I mean, if you look at just the current situation for driverless, for delivery drivers, you have about 1.4 to 1.8 delivery drivers in the US. They make between $10 to $22 an hour. You're able to drive about 30 to 80 million just by that cost savings. If you look at 24/7 shifts, you're adding another 15 billion. And that's just existing market. If you look at what you can unlock from services that you could add, think about laundry delivery, think about pet food delivery. There's a lot of other areas that I haven't even thought about that could be unlocked because of that driverless future that's happening right now. And more importantly, what are we doing for the environment, for the planet? How does that affect it? Currently, those drivers, that 1.4 million drivers, cost the US about $28 billion in congestion cost annually. That's a big cost. And you haven't counted the carbon footprint, all the other issues that we have. With driverless delivery and with electric vehicles, we're able to solve that. And that's really exciting for us. And we're very happy to be part of that future. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Shadi. I mean, lots of interesting things packed into that, I think, and we'll come to the questions in a second, but I like the idea of picking that idea of that it's not a pie to be divided, but actually it's an ocean to be explored, picking up some of the things actually that came in Benedict's presentation, I think. Yep. Also timing, that kind of key to unlocking the future. So much more of an opportunity-based thing by providing a solution, which I thought was really interesting. Let's pick up some of the questions here. Interesting. So when will we start seeing your vehicles roaming the streets of Prague, Shadi?
Tomorrow, if I have an offer from somebody to help me in Prague.
Okay, that's for everybody out here to see Shadi afterwards. Right. We've got here a couple of things which are about kind of compatibility, cities. Will the vehicles be compatible with European cities? I mean, interesting actually, walking around Prague, just how cobbled the streets are, right. Things like that. How will that work? Will that require, I mean, if there's a big drive for these things, will that require cities to change some of these things?
I mean, the first half of that, I think European cities are actually a perfect fit because our focus really on urban delivery, not highways. So anything within 10 to 20 miles from an urban center is really ideal, especially a city like Prague, which has a lot of sidewalks. It has a lot of really interesting road and a close-knit kind of community. But I think the city planners have to really start thinking really very thoughtfully about their cities. I mean, I notice in Prague that you guys have a lot of congestion. That's an issue, right? If I think about what's happening in Michigan, so we're working with a city in north of Michigan, and the city planners, as well as the city councilmen, as well as the police, all sitting in the same meeting to discuss how can we implement this. We're even thinking about having dedicated lanes similar to bikes that are especially for driverless delivery. We really have to think about this because if you dedicate this type of focus on your city planning, then you're really going to be seeing a totally different future. You're going to start solving all those congestion issues that you have right now.
Okay, good. We've got lots of questions coming through. So let's just see. I get, how is it protected against theft? Which is an interesting question.
Yeah.
Do you expect gangs of marauding people attacking them? What's the?
You know, I always get that question. You know, so it's kind of a very interesting question. In the United States, you know, one of the most dangerous jobs are actually pizza delivery drivers, because they get jumped all the time and they get, you know, mugged all the time. With the B1, you're going to encounter the same issues, but here's the difference. B1 can see you a mile away, can take your picture all the time. It has 360 cameras. It has LiDARs. It can talk to you. It can scare you away. It can call the police in an instant. That's pretty secure.
Okay, good. Looking at the cities point, which cities will be the first ones to introduce kind of your cars, whether or not that's a preferred option for you, or whether you think that there are certain cities, whether that's the States or in Europe, who are more likely to be the first ones to take a stand and say, we're going to have these autonomous vehicles?
Right. So definitely in Michigan, because that's our neighborhood, so it's a little bit easier for us to test. But in Europe, we're actually working with Paris as well as Montpellier city to have testing hopefully next year. So that's where hopefully you'll see B1 roaming the streets.
Okay, good. We've got a couple of social ones here. So there's obviously the saving in terms of, you mentioned in the slide at the end there, there's the saving in terms of not paying drivers and also congestion issues. What about the drivers and their jobs? Is that an element of concern? Do you think there'll be some form of taxation, coming back to Alex's presentation? How will that be dealt with, and do you think that's going to end up with you getting some pushback against what you're doing?
So I'll talk from a US perspective, and I like the presentation where I think you were talking about that you cannot stop technology. So that train has left the station already. But here's the thing, what kind of jobs are we replacing? I just mentioned that pizza delivery drivers is one of the most dangerous. If you look at, again, that statistic from the Labor Department where the delivery driver growth is actually dropping. These are not desired jobs. Would you rather be driving something with almost like a robotic approach, or would you prefer to be in a control center, maybe monitoring these or being part of designing these? I think those are the jobs of the future, and we should really be aggressive and forward-thinking into getting into those jobs instead of being stuck and saying, well, you know, the car is not going to replace the doom buggy anytime soon.
I'm going to tackle the other risk one, which is up here, which is it takes one negative story, which is interesting because that also picks up a theme that we've had. This one is saying a bomb in one of your delivery vehicles exploding, and then the public fighting against it. I suppose anything new that comes in, people will perceive risks of that. I suppose in terms of security, that means you've got to have something in plan for that, and how you prepare for those kinds of scenarios.
Yeah, sure. So I'll talk briefly about B1. So B1, you cannot really open it unless it sees you and it knows who you are. So we have facial recognition. So it's going to be hard for you to really open this unless you have authorization. But let's say you even went that step and did that. We actually have cameras to recognize what are you actually putting inside B1. At the end of the day, you really cannot prevent if somebody is really determined to do this, if it's on a plane, on a car, or on B1 at the end of the day. But I think this is kind of, you know, it's a little bit of a larger issue as far as negative stories. You know, if I tell you today, you know, I'm going to introduce a new technology to airplanes, but hey, you know, about 20 planes are going to fall out of the sky, I don't think anybody would sign up to that. But if you think about what's happening in the US at least, in the last 3 years, actually fatalities because of car accident, have jumped for the first time in the last 3 years. It keeps jumping after it was dropping. That's something to think about from a security perspective.
Okay, good. We've got things picking up, so interesting progression of the topic today, but then picking up that point of addressing power, connectivity, infrastructure requirements. We've talked about that a little bit in terms of cities, but what about those things like power, connectivity?
Yeah, I think what's good, especially guys in Europe are doing pretty good as far as having a grid to recharge electric vehicles. I think Tesla in the US is doing a great job. So for us, we're really going to be following that. So I'll give you a great example. One of the city that we're testing with in Michigan, they actually have an autonomous bus, and they already have the infrastructure to charge that. So we're going to piggyback off of that and do the same thing.
Okay, good. Interesting one there that's just come in, which is, will every household have their own one for running chores?
I mean, that's possible. I mean, to be honest with you, we start seeing the cost, as I mentioned, with the LiDAR, but we're seeing that with everything that's being commoditized. I could definitely see a future where you have a dedicated one. But, you know, from a cost perspective or a need or a pain point, I don't see the need for that. It's a little bit different than having your own autonomous car. Maybe you want a certain storage to always be yours. But for a B1, I'm not sure why would you need one if you can access the same services and you don't have to bother with having that capital cost. I think the future is really more kind of ride sharing, and the same thing applies for services like B1.
Okay, we've got a couple of specific ones here. What Three Words, who actually presented here last year, which was a very interesting session. Are you considering using that address system? Do you know what that address system is?
Absolutely. It's kind of funny. Actually, What Three Words is the one that recommended to this conference. So okay. I know him pretty well.
Okay, good. So maybe you are.
Yeah.
There was also one about how can people recognize their package within B1? How does the system react to customers pick up errors if they're making an error?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So one of the things that we're doing, and that's kind of unique, is we actually have our own natural language understanding. So we don't leave it to Amazon or to Google to do that. And this is kind of a very interesting point I want to kind of talk about just a little bit. Not only our business, but a lot of businesses should face that question. If you think about the technology itself, the barrier of entry to, I remember the old days when we did a Ford Sync. For the people who don't know, that was one of the first voice assistant that Microsoft and Ford did. For one command, just to say change the radio, we used to have to design about 100 different commands the way you say it. Right now, we only have to know the intent, and then the dialogue that exists right now, and millions of dialogue can do that with deep learning. So from a technology point of view, we're already doing that. And from a business point of view, we don't want, you know, as a business, your know-how is actually embedded in these kind of commands, right? So from the hospitals, they don't want that to go to Google or Amazon. So that's something that's very important. So I'm kind of bringing it, I'm taking advantage of this question to kind of describe that, but what's interesting when you encounter B1, you'll actually be talking to an intelligent entity. So you can ask it, what's in your compartment? Can you go there? Can you come back? So it's not only an app, but it's actually a natural language understanding voice that you interact with.
Okay, good. I'm going to try and keep us on track. So we'll just do one last question from here, which is, how much would this puppy cost?
We have to have a private conversation about that, so that's private information, unfortunately.
Okay, good. So that's for the person who might be considering bringing them to Prague. Talk to Shadi afterwards, and he will tell you. Really interesting. Good final pickup, I think, for this, looking at the solutions. So if you'd join me in thanking Shadi, that would be great. Thank you, Shadi.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.